Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is James Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 7 wide receiver rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups, giving you guys an idea as to which are the most advantageous matchups going into the week based on how many points defenses are allowing to opposing wide receivers. Then we'll transition into talking about my top 43 wide receiver rankings, as I'll share with you guys my thought process, opinions, and of course statistics in order to justify these players' overall rankings. If you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, you can travel down to the description of the video. While you're down there, of course, be sure to subscribe, click the like button down below, and of course, click the notification bell. Every day I live stream here on the channel. Later tonight, it'll be around 7 to 7:15 PST. So if you guys are interested, have any questions, be sure to swing on by. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about matchups at the position. I've gone ahead and accumulated the total wide receiver receiving statistics allowed by each individual defense over the course of the first 6 weeks of the season. As you guys can see, the Minnesota Vikings still at the top of this conversation in regards to fantasy points per game allowed to opposing wide receivers, as they've allowed over 1,000 receiving yards and, of course, a bunch of statistics across the board. Typically because, again, they are in a positive game script, and teams that they are facing them often have to throw the ball for majority of the second half. Just looking at the last two matchups that the Minnesota Vikings have faced against the Jets and Packers, in the second half of those games, those offenses had to throw for majority of the time because, of course, the Minnesota Vikings had granted themselves a huge lead in the first half of those games. Nonetheless, we also have the Baltimore Ravens, Jacksonville Jaguars, Detroit Lions, Washington Commanders, Buccaneers, all matchups that we will absolutely be taking advantage of going into the week. Now, some of the more difficult matchups on the complete opposite end of the spectrum is taking on the Denver Broncos, secondary and cornerbacks, the Jets, the Dolphins, the Titans, the Chiefs. Defenses that have played well over multiple seasons and based on their personnel continue to lock down opposing wide receivers. It's not impossible to succeed against them, but it is very difficult and often happens very few times. Either way, we'll go ahead and refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode. Let's go ahead and let's get into my top 43 wide receiver rankings, beginning with the thumbnail of today's episode. It is Justin Jefferson who takes on the Detroit Lions. Not only is the Detroit Lions a top 5 matchup at the position, as they are allowing over 34 fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR scoring format to opposing wide receivers, but we have seen Justin Jefferson in his entire career dominate against the Detroit Lions, a division rival. Just giving you a little bit of perspective as to the most recent performances that Justin Jefferson has had against the Detroit Lions secondary. All right, so last season, 12 catches, 192 and a touchdown. 6 catches, 141 and a touchdown. Then you go to the year prior, 11 catches for 223, 11 catches for 182 and a touchdown. Then you go to the year prior to that, 7 for 124 and 9 for 133. 7 of the last 8 games that Justin Jefferson has played against the Detroit Lions secondary, he has surpassed 130 receiving yards. Whatever his number ends up being on Underdog this week, I am taking the higher in that overall conversation. We're expecting it to be a shootout between these two high-powered offenses and secondaries that really just cannot keep up with the rest of the league. Now, speaking of putting together a potential pick'em entry regarding Justin Jefferson's receiving yards, if you guys haven't checked out Underdog, be sure to travel down to the description. As of this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, potentially tail a couple of my picks going into this week. We've been on fire for the last 3 consecutive weeks, but you're going to get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, flex, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings to help you set your lineups on Sunday mornings and, of course, help you capture victories to an eventual 2024 Fantasy Football Championship. For those of you wondering if you're eligible of taking advantage of the overall opportunity, check out the map to the right side of the screen and, of course, be able to go ahead and potentially tail some of those overall entries. We'll have a couple mentioned at the end of tomorrow's video when we talk about the quarterback and tight end rankings for the Thursday night game. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, let's continue on with the wide receiver conversation, beginning with A.J. Brown as our number 2. A.J. Brown for back-to-back games, over 115 receiving yards and 1 receiving touchdown minimum. And quite frankly, that is the A.J. Brown common scoreline. And if there are going to be some sort of inconsistencies of play, if DeVonta Smith is going to step up because of the absence of Dallas Goedert, there's always a possibility of him having himself a lackluster performance, but ultimately, he is an elite wide receiver taking on a secondary, which again cannot stop opposing wide receivers, even though they were able to bottle up T. Higgins and Jamar Chase to each both having about 70 yards apiece. I mean, really, the fact of the matter is A.J. Brown is an automatic start. The Giants defenses have allowed 70 or more receiving yards to opposing wide receivers, 5 of them in the last 4 games alone. So we're anticipating A.J. Brown to get himself his 70 yards plus, probably a touchdown, and be able to feast, especially considering the Giants defense is going to have to try to stop Saquon Barkley every single down in that rivalry revenge game. Number 3, speaking of the New York Giants matchup, we have Malik Nabers. We did see a little bit of progression in regards to his concussion protocol earlier today. Did end up getting a limited practice with a red jersey on. He is in the next step of his overall concussion protocol and one step closer to returning. And hopefully this is the week, like we talked about last week, in hopes of him potentially returning. From weeks 2 through 4, when healthy, was averaging 15 targets per game, 10 receptions per game, 107 receiving yards and 1 receiving touchdown per game, in a half PPR, nearly 22 fantasy points per game on average throughout those last 3 games in which he has participated in. In his absence, Darius Slayton, for back-to-back games, has been able to sustain 11 total targets in each of those overall contests. Not only that, it would have been 2 consecutive weeks in a row where Darius Slayton was a complete monster if it wasn't for the fact that, of course, that penalty was called last week, pulling back his 60-yard reception. The number 1 receiving option of this offense, the number 1 outside receiver, whether it is Malik Nabers, Slayton, is going to find themselves success, especially considering the Eagles are the 8th best matchup at the position, allowing over 30.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average. Number 4, we have Amon-Ra St. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Justin Jefferson dominates against Detroit, but Minnesota is technically the best matchup at the position. So Amon-Ra St. should be able to take advantage of it, considering they're allowing over 38 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Some of the more recent wide receiver performances: Garrett Wilson, 13 catches, 101 and a touchdown. Allen Lazard in the same game, 4 for 34 and a touchdown. Jayden Reed within the slot position, 7 for 139 and a touchdown. And even Dontayvion Wicks in the same game, 5 for 78 and 2 touchdowns. So Amon-Ra St. Jameson Williams, Laporta, all implicated to have pretty solid weeks. This is going to be the games in which you take higher on every single number. But especially considering last season, Amon-Ra St. taking on the Minnesota Vikings defense in week 16 and 18, put up 7 catches for 144 and a touchdown, 12 catches for 106 and a touchdown. He has dominated against them in the past most recently, and is going to have another opportunity to take advantage of an incredible matchup here. Number 5 to close out the S here is Ja'Marr Chase. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is he is an automatic start every single week, especially considering how much potential for upside he has. Now, unfortunately, this last week, 6 targets, which again is not enough opportunity for the elite nature that he presents every single week, especially when he is the number 2 target in the offense ever since T. Higgins has returned. In the last 3 weeks, has been out-targeted by Higgins every single contest. Either way, they have an opportunity against a rival in the Cleveland Browns to be able to potentially exact some revenge, mainly because Joe Burrow in his entire career has only ever beat the Browns one singular time. So hopefully, because of all of the inconsistency of play that we have seen from the Browns offense, it is going to give more and more opportunities for Burrow and the boys to continue to air it out, look in the direction of Ja'Marr Chase. Again, most recently, we have seen AJB 6 catches for 116 and a touchdown, McLaurin for 112 receiving yards, Nabers for 78 and 2 touchdowns against his Cleveland secondary. So why not Chase and Higgins dominating against the secondary? Number 6, to begin the A tier, we have Drake London. Look, Drake London has been incredible thus far this season. In each of the last 3 games, double-digit plus targets. And also, in 3 of the last 4 games, scoring 1 singular touchdown minimum. Again, amongst all players in the National Football League right now, Drake London is number 2 amongst all of them in terms of red zone targets and receiving touchdowns. He is continuing to get the most valuable opportunities on the field and continuing to get himself enough opportunities to sustain his high level of success. Now, going into this week against the Seattle Seahawks, again, the Seattle Seahawks offense has not been playing well in the first half. It has opened up a lot of opportunities for opposing offenses to take early leads. Whichever way this goes about, the secondary of the Seattle Seahawks defense really also hasn't played well in this 3-game slide. Most recently, Detroit receivers, 186 and 2 touchdowns. New York Giants receivers, 158 and 2 touchdowns. And San Francisco for 166 and a touchdown. There should be a lot of success here for the Atlanta Falcons receiving core, and mainly Drake London. Number 7, we have Chris Godwin, who is coming off of arguably the best performance of his entire career. An unbelievable game of 11 catches for 125 and 2 receiving touchdowns. And we knew that in the absence of Mike Evans, mainly because of the kryptonite matchup against Marshawn Lattimore, there would be more opportunities for Chris Godwin. And that's exactly what presented itself. Now, going into this week's matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, this is a matchup where you either put up or you shut up. It's a very good football team on the opposite side, and the Baltimore Ravens are going to score. And amongst both these overall teams, both of them are averaging over 29.5 points per game as a team thus far this season. So this should be a high-scoring matchup and a back-and-forth one between both teams. And considering the Baltimore Ravens are so good at stopping the run, the anticipation would be a lot of passing for Baker Mayfield, especially in the direction of Godwin and Evans. Again, the Ravens are allowing the second most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers thus far this season. Again, most recently, the Dallas Cowboys receiver, 13 catches, 202 touchdowns. Cincinnati, 20 catches for 315 and 4 touchdowns. Pretty rare. But then Washington last week, 16 receptions, 154, 2 touchdowns. There's a lot of opportunity for success here for Chris Godwin and the receiving core of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Number 8, we have Stefon Diggs. Look, Stefon Diggs in the absence of Nico Collins is only going to continue to elevate his overall production. Now, for 4 consecutive weeks, even when Nico Collins has been in the lineup, he has had himself 75 or more total yards in 4 consecutive games. So the opportunity is there. The production has been there. It's just a matter of, is he going to score a touchdown? That's really the only difference maker in this overall circumstance. Last week, he played his most overall snaps outside of the slot position that he has all season long. I mean, the reason he was able to score that receiving touchdown was because they lined him up outside one-on-one against Christian Gonzalez, and he made an incredible move, ran a post, and absolutely just snapped his ankles up and ended up scoring. So as long as they continue to give him opportunities on the outside, which of course last season dominated in those opportunities as a Buffalo Bill, as a Minnesota Viking, that is where he's been comfortable. Lining up on the outside just gives him an opportunity to take apart any sort of defensive back that they want to throw at him on a weekly basis. Moving on to our number 9, we have Jayden Reed. Look, Jayden Reed is a primary slot receiving option. And last week, again, even though he did leave the game early with an injury, playing only 53% of the offensive snaps, he still got himself 6 receptions, 28 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. And this week, taking on the Texans, as a primary slot receiving option, we have seen a lot of wide receivers find themselves success against Houston. Pop Douglas last week, 6 catches for 92 and a touchdown. Christian Kirk, a couple weeks prior, 7 catches for 61 and a touchdown. There has been a lot of success within that overall conversation. I know that Jayden Reed is still dealing with an injury. We're going to have to keep that monitored as the week progresses. But if he's healthy and he's playing this week, he's an automatic start at a top 10 capacity. Moving on to our number 10, we have Terry McLaurin. Look, Terry McLaurin has been incredible. In the offseason, I said that Jaden Daniels would be the best quarterback that Terry McLaurin would ever play with in his entire career. And that was an understatement. What Jayden Daniels has done for Terry McLaurin over the course of the last 4 weeks is ridiculous. Since week 3, he's been the number 7 overall wide receiver in fantasy football in terms of a fantasy point per game average in a half PPR scoring format. Now has an opportunity of taking on the Carolina Panthers, who have not stopped anyone on defense all season long. I mean, just some of the more recent performances against this Carolina Panthers secondary. Drake London, 6 for 74 and a touchdown. DJ Moore, 5 for 105 and 2 touchdowns. Jamar Chase, 3 for 85 and a touchdown. Myers, had himself a receiving touchdown. Johnston, 2 receiving touchdowns. Shaheed, 73 and a touchdown. Every single wide receiver has found success against this defense. Therefore, Terry McLaurin is the next man up with this overall conversation. Moving on to our number 11, we have Zay Flowers. Look, Zay Flowers honestly could very easily be implicated to be an 8-tier wide receiver. The only reason he sits in this overall conversation is because he is very much so dependent on whether or not the game script is positive or negative. And what I mean by that is, in the games in which the Baltimore Ravens are blowing out their opponents, he is very much so not implicated to be a scoring option for fantasy. In the 2 blowout games against Dallas and Buffalo, he's averaged 3 targets per game and 2.65 fantasy points per game in those contests. In comparison to the competitive matchups that he has had this season against Washington, Las Vegas, Kansas City, and Cincinnati, averaging 10.5 targets per game and 15.03 fantasy points per game. So depending on how this matchup is going to go, obviously the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are a high-powered offense. Both these teams thus far this season averaging over 29 points per game as a team. The expectation would be a competitive matchup, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So Zay Flowers, again, an automatic play, and hopefully he's getting himself the ample opportunity he deserves. Moving on to our number 12, we have Diontae Johnson. Look, Diontae Johnson has played incredibly well. And if it wasn't for the fact that he took on Jalen Johnson just a couple weeks back, he would be on a consecutive game streak of dominating. Because in the last 3 advantageous matchups that he has faced, averaging 10 targets per game, 5.7 receptions, 74 receiving yards, and has scored 2 touchdowns in those last 3 games, which has led up to a 14.5 fantasy point per game average. The Commanders this week, the 5th best matchup at the position, allowing over 33.4 fantasy points per game in the overall category. The expectation, considering how well the Washington Commanders offense has played, is a negative game script. That means Andy Dalton, for the entirety of that second half, throwing the ball in the direction of his primary wide receivers. His number 1 favorite wide receiver thus far this season, Diontae Johnson, in a negative game script, finding himself a lot of target opportunity within these overall weeks. Number 13, we have Cooper Kupp. So here's the fact of the matter. We know that Cooper Kupp earlier today, according to Sean McVay, did end up participating in some form of practice, in some wide receiver drills. And Sean McVay did in fact say that there is a possibility that Cooper Kupp could end up playing this week against the Las Vegas Raiders. We are hoping that is the case, especially considering the Los Angeles Rams, they are a 1-4 football team. They need to get to at least 3-6 in the next couple weeks. Because last season, the Los Angeles Rams, they started 3-6 and they still made a playoff push. They just need to get Cooper Kupp back in the lineup and ready to go because, quite frankly, not only is it an advantageous matchup, we have seen Diontae Johnson go over 120 in a touchdown against his defense, Flowers for 91 in a touchdown. We've seen wide receivers find success against Las Vegas as of thus far this season. And if Cooper's going to be in the lineup, expect 12-plus targets and a lot of success within the overall week, hopefully healthy and ready to go from the ankle injury. Number 14, we have Mike Evans. Even though Mike Evans is coming off of his kryptonite matchup against Marshon Lattimore, that was expected. We warned you, and we will continue on starting him every single week because once he is not in a kryptonite matchup, he's expected to go back to being a stud wide receiver option. And that's what he's demonstrated over the course of this season. I mean, there are 3 games thus far this season in which he has scored over 20 fantasy points. So even though he has taken on Marshon Lattimore and Patrick Surtain, the rest of the time he has been a great force for fantasy and has an opportunity taking on the Baltimore Ravens in most likely a negative game script, which is, again, the Baltimore Ravens allowing the second most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Most recently, like I mentioned with Chris Godwin, Dallas for 202 touchdowns from their wide receivers, Cincinnati 315 and 4 touchdowns, Washington 154 and 2 touchdowns. If this defense is going to continue to allow touchdowns, a lot of yardage to opposing wide receivers, what better offense to take them on than the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? Number 15, we have DK Metcalf. Now, very similar to Mike Evans, even though DK Metcalf is coming off of a lackluster performance himself, it wasn't for a lack of overall trying. An opportunity, 11 total targets, even had a receiving touchdown called back. And even though DK Metcalf doesn't have a great track record against the San Francisco 49ers in his most recent performances, I will tell you he does have a good track record taking on the Atlanta Falcons, who he has a privilege of taking on this week. In the last 3 games in which he has taken on the Falcons secondary, has scored 4 total touchdowns. We are anticipating a huge week and a huge bounce back performance. And hopefully, as we have seen over the course of this entire 3-game slide, it's going to be a negative game script and a lot of passing attempts from the Seattle Seahawks offense. Majority of those looking in the direction of DK Metcalf. We have seen wide receivers like Diontae Johnson most recently, 6 catches for 78 and a touchdown against the Atlanta secondary. Evans, 5 for 62 and a touchdown. Olave, 8 for 87. Wide receivers can find success on the outside. It's DK Metcalf's week to get back on track. Moving on to our number 16. We have Garrett Wilson. Even with the addition of Davante Adams, I still do believe that Garrett Wilson is going to get himself a lot of opportunity within this offense, coming off of back-to-back weeks of over 100 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. You know, the offense looked significantly more efficient with the new offensive coordinator, Todd Downing, taking over in comparison to what Nathaniel Hackett presented. But we know that Davante Adams is immediately going to come in and find himself success. And because this is a Nathaniel Hackett offense and Davante Adams has played underneath that overall umbrella back in Green Bay, he is going to immediately and seamlessly transition to the offense and be a playmaker. But this gives Garrett Wilson the opportunity to take on number 2 cornerbacks for the remainder of the season. Just like we talk about with T. Higgins taking on number 2 cornerbacks, even though he's a number 1, that is the case for Garrett Wilson. He will have easier matchups henceforth, and in those opportunities, even find himself more success than he has thus far this season. I'm anticipating a lot of success this week as Aaron Rodgers should be airing it out against this defense. There's even more opportunities now for them every single drive to score and give Garrett Wilson even more upside. Moving on to our number 17, we have DeVonta Smith. Now, like I mentioned earlier this week, considering Dallas Goedert is dealing with a hamstring injury, we have to look to the past to see how well DeVonta Smith has played in the absence of Dallas Goedert. When we go back to 2022 and 2023, in the games in which Dallas Goedert missed due to injury, and in fact, there were 8 of those games, we saw DeVonta Smith averaging 14.95 fantasy points per game on average, while averaging nearly 9 targets per game throughout that span of time. And that was in a completely different offense where DeVonta Smith wasn't being given very much opportunity. Already thus far this season, averaging 8 targets per game. So I can only imagine that those numbers are going to increase to double-digit targets per game, potentially even 16+ fantasy points per game. Maybe even more, 18 plus in a half PPR scoring format, considering how well he has played thus far this season within the slot position. Taking on the New York Giants, again, is a secondary that is going to be taken advantage of, especially as they try to commit to stopping the run against Saquon Barkley. It's going to open up that many more opportunities for DeVonta Smith and A.J. Brown within the passing game. Moving on to our number 18, T. Higgins. Like I mentioned earlier, again, he has an opportunity every single week of taking on the number 2 cornerback of every defense that they face, considering Jamar Chase is pulling number 1 coverage. And because of that, T. Higgins has been the more favorable option within the offense for 3 consecutive weeks. We have seen T. Higgins out-target Jamar Chase. So if in fact that is going to continue to trend in that direction, taking on the Cleveland Browns, a defense that has allowed 6 catches for 116 and a touchdown to AJB most recently. In that same game, DeVonta Smith also scored a touchdown. The week prior, we had Terry McLaurin with 112 receiving yards, and also another outside wide receiver like Malik Nabers earlier this year, 8 catches, 78, 2 touchdowns. A lot of wide receivers have found success against this defense. T. Higgins is the next man up. Moving on to our number 19, we have Davante Adams, the newest member of the New York Jets offense. When we go back to 2021, in the last season in which we saw Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams play together, in that year, Davante Adams was averaging 10.6 targets per game and 17.43 fantasy points per game if you include the entire regular season and playoff run. That's a lot of opportunity, and I anticipate that to kind of be the overall baseline that we would anticipate. Now, he may not get that immediate overall opportunity share because he is just joining the offense. You know, he's technically coming off a quote-unquote hamstring injury. Again, I don't think he was hurt. I think he just wanted out, and that's exactly what ended up happening. There's a reason why he immediately passed his physical, and he's ready to go and play on Sunday. He already said that he's going to play. The head coach has already said that he plans on playing, and already had a full practice earlier today. He's very familiar with the overall scheme, considering he played under a Nathaniel Hackett offense and an Aaron Rodgers offense back in Green Bay. So he's immediately going to be plugged in as the number one wide receiver. Hopefully find himself 8+ targets of opportunity. I mean, this Pittsburgh Steelers secondary has their hands full with all the weapons that are going to be thrown at it going into this week's contest. Moving on to our number 20, we have Tank Dell. Look, Tank Dell has played incredibly well when given a fair share of opportunity. And that's exactly what he received last week against the New England Patriots. 9 targets, 7 catches, 57 and a touchdown, and had himself a great overall week. Now, when we have looked at the last 2 seasons of Tank Dell's overall career, when given ample opportunity, there have been 6 games in which he has had 8 or more targets. In those games, averaging 19.0 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. In every single one of those contests, putting up over 14.5 fantasy points and a half PPR with 1 touchdown receiving minimum. Again, the expectation for Tank Dell taking on the Green Bay Packers is, yes, they're a great secondary. They have played well. But Tank Dell within this offense, and now within the outside role of what Nico Collins is typically in, if he's going to get himself 10+ targets, the expectation is immediate success for another consecutive game. Moving on to our number 21, Deebo Samuel, who again takes on the Kansas City Chiefs. And as of late, the Kansas City Chiefs have really had the number of the San Francisco 49ers. They've beaten them in the last 4 consecutive matchups. So not only is this a revenge game for the Super Bowls, plural, but this is a revenge game to try to see if you can actually defeat the Kansas City defense and secondary, who has played incredibly well against opposing wide receivers thus far this season. But there have been wide receivers that have found success recently. I mean, Rashid Shaheed, 4 catches for 86 and a touchdown. McConkey, 5 for 67 and a touchdown. London for 6 and 67 and a touchdown. So why not Deebo Samuel, the primary wide receiver of this offense, who can get it done on the ground through the air, just needs the opportunity share, and he will find himself success within the overall week. Number 22, we have Brian Thomas Jr. Look, Brian Thomas Jr. has an opportunity this week of taking on the New England Patriots. Even though he did get locked down last week, and we were anticipating that to be the case, mainly because he was taking on Jalen Johnson, the primary number 1 corner of the Chicago Bears, this week has an opportunity of taking on Christian Gonzalez, which is another great cornerback, but can certainly be able to find himself success. I mean, last week, Brian Thomas Jr. dropped a touchdown. So there was an opportunity there for him to be a double-digit fantasy scorer, just wasn't able to bring it down. Outside of that, I mean, again, from weeks 1 through 5 thus far this season, averaging 6.8 targets, 4.4 receptions, 79 receiving yards, and 0.6 receiving touchdowns per game, 14 fantasy points per game on average. It doesn't matter who he's faced outside of Jalen Johnson, he has been a fantastic wide receiver for us in fantasy. We're coming off of a week in which Dell and Diggs both were able to surpass 6 receptions, over 55 receiving yards, and both scored a receiving touchdown. We're hoping for a lot of success from Brian Thomas Jr. in London on Sunday morning. Don't forget, stream starts at 6 a.m. PST. Thank you. Moving on to our number 23. Coming off of the bye week, we have Tyreek Hill. Again, when you take on the Indianapolis Colts, unless your name is Calvin Ridley, everybody should find success, mainly because, again, thus far this season, they've allowed 4 different wide receivers, BTJ, Pickens, Odunze, and Nico Collins, all of them to surpass over 110 receiving yards against that secondary. Many of those players that I just mentioned scoring a touchdown in those games as well. Nonetheless, this is the 7th best matchup at the position. We are going to hope that Tyler Huntley, in this overall bye week, prepared himself to throw the ball deep in the direction of Tyreek Hill. It only takes one singular play, and the last time he was out in week 5 with Tyler Huntley, 10 targets, 6 catches, 69, 9.9 fantasy points. The opportunities were there. Just got to continue to air it out against a secondary like the Colts, which again cannot stop a soul. Number 24. We have Brandon Aiyuk. You would assume that in this game against the Kansas City Chiefs, the Chiefs, again, a great secondary, but really an elite run-stopping defense. It would be very difficult for Grendo and or Jordan Mason to find success on a consistent basis within the overall running attack. Therefore, we would anticipate a lot of passing from Brock Purdy. George Kittle is going to be his number 1. That's a given, especially considering the Chiefs are giving the most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Kittle's going to be the number 1. Then if you were to assume that Deebo is the number 2, Brandon Aiyuk really just needs 7 total targets within the game, and I can promise you he will be relevant. If he catches a vast majority of them, they're not like completely on the floor, uncatchable overall opportunities. He will be relevant within the overall game. This is a revenge game. Again, they're trying to, make up for a couple of those losses that they've recently had against the Kansas City Chiefs on the big stage. We know that Brandon Aiyuk, after this most recent Super Bowl, wasn't excited about his overall usage within that game. I'm sure they're going to address that and give him as much opportunity as possible in order to exact some revenge on the Kansas City Chiefs. Number 25, we have Darnell Mooney. Look, Darnell Mooney has been a great player thus far this season. But unfortunately, due to this last week's overall game script taking on the Carolina Panthers, they jumped out to an early lead, and they ran the ball as an offense, the Atlanta Falcons, 33 times with Bijan and, Algier. So when you run the ball 33 times to kill the clock, it is not going to lead to a lot of opportunity for Mooney. Only 5 total targets. Again, this week against the Seattle Seahawks, it could be the same. But hopefully, considering the Seahawks secondary has not played well, and again, they've given up to Detroit 186 and 2 touchdowns to wide receivers, to the New York Giants wide receivers 158, 2 touchdowns, San Francisco 166 and a touchdown. Considering all the success that have been found recently against the secondary, hopefully Mooney is implicated for his normal 8 targets plus, and hopefully finding the end zone. Moving on to our number 26, Jordan Addison. In the same vein in which Justin Jefferson should find himself a lot of success, so should Jordan Addison. I mean, again, this is the 4th best matchup at the position, taking on the Detroit Lions that are allowing over 34 fantasy points per game on average in this overall category. Most recently, Lamb, 89 receiving yards, Metcalf 104, Marvin Harrison 64 and a touchdown, Godwin 117 and a touchdown. A lot of wide receivers have found success, and considering Darnold's touchdown success thus far this season, again, 11 passing touchdowns in the 5 games that they have played, and the lack of a running game, mainly because Aaron Jones is a little bit beat up. Additionally, you're playing against the Detroit Lions, who stop the run better than just about anybody in the league. This is going to be an air raid offense that is going to have to air it out 40 plus times, and hopefully a lot of targets going in the direction of Jordan Addison, the number 2 receiving option of this offense. Again, getting themselves a lot of opportunities, taking on the number 2 cornerback, while of course Justin Jefferson on the other side of the field being double teamed the entire game. Moving on to our number 27, this will begin the overall slot receiving experience, beginning with Juju Smith-Schuster taking on the San Francisco 49ers. Like I mentioned on Monday's waiver wire episode, Juju's coming off an incredible game back in week 5 against the Saints of 7 grabs for 130 and 16.5 fantasy points. It could have been even more if he was to haul in that touchdown, which was a tipped pass that led to an interception. But when we go back to 2022, as a member of the Kansas City Chiefs, as a primary starter, in the 9 overall games in which Juju Smith-Schuster was given 5 or more targets, was averaging 16.38 fantasy points per game. In 7 of those 9 overall games, leading to 10 or more fantasy points. The expectation, considering they haven't brought in any other receiving, help within this offense in the absence of Rashee Rice and Marquise Hollywood Brown, outside of Kelsey, Juju Smith is the next man to get himself the vast majority of targets within this attack. Number 28, speaking of slot receiving options, we have Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Again, both players that have hyphenated names, but are going to find himself a lot of success this week. Now, Jaxon Smith-Njigba takes on D. Alford this week. He's the primary nickel cornerback of the Atlanta Falcons secondary. He has given up the most receptions, targets, and receiving yards to opposing slot receiving options thus far this season amongst all nickel cornerbacks in the National Football League. Therefore, JSN, who's coming off of the last 3 weeks of averaging 9.33 targets per game in negative game scripts, if this is once again going to be a negative game script, anticipate that Jaxon Smith-Njigba is going to get the targets and find himself a lot of success within the overall week. Number 29, speaking of another receiving option that is in the slot position, it is Demario Douglas, coming off an incredible week of 9 targets, 6 catches, 92 and a touchdown, within the first game of Drake May's overall tenure as a starting quarterback of the New England Patriots. The 3rd overall pick, looking in the direction of Demario Douglas often. 9 targets on 33 total passing attempts, leading to a 27% target share, which in his first game is an incredible overall number. When you take on the Jacksonville Jaguars, the 3rd best matchup at the position, nearly allowing 35 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, the anticipation would be that Demario Douglas should see himself a lot of opportunity, especially when Demario Douglas is playing 79% of his overall snaps thus far this season. From the slot position, we have seen slot receiving options such as Keenan Allen, 5 catches, 41 and 2 touchdowns. Josh Downs, 9 catches for 69. Shakir, 6 catches for 72 and a touchdown. A lot of wide receivers have found success against Jacksonville within the slot receiving position. And of course, so did Stefon Diggs. I even forgot to mention that. A lot of players have found success. Now it's Demario Douglas' turn in London to do the same. The last slot receiving option I wanted to mention to close out the top 30 conversation is Wan'Dale Robinson. Amongst all receiving options in the National Football League, number 2 in terms of total targets. The opportunity share is there, and they have an opportunity of taking on the 8th best matchup at the position. Most recently, we have seen, of course, other wide receivers find a bunch of success, but even Wan'Dale Robinson, if you go back to week 18 of last season, 5 catches for 85 and 11 fantasy points against this defense. Those are the kind of numbers we're anticipating. If Malik Nabers has returned, it's going to even open up more for this offense as they'll be able to, of course, continue to advance the ball down the field and give themselves opportunities within the red zone against this Philadelphia Eagles secondary. Moving on to our number 31, we have Courtland Sutton. The fact of the matter is, Courtland Sutton is by far and away the number 1 receiving option of this offense. And taking on the Saints, which is the 10th best matchup, would typically lead you to believe that there's going to be automatic success, especially in a game in which the Saints don't have Derek Carr, Olave, Shaheed. They're going to be running the ball. So will the Denver Broncos, but Bo Nix is in a better position considering the rapport he has already built with Courtland Sutton. I mean, thus far this season, in 3 of the last 4 games, Sutton has surpassed 10 or more fantasy points in a half PPR. Amongst all players in the league, he's number 5 in terms of total red zone targets. As long as those opportunities continue to go in his direction on a consistent basis, even going up against the Saints, even though they have given up the majority of their stats to opposing slot receiving options, Courtland Sutton should be implicated for a pretty solid week going into week 7. Number 32, we have Jakobi Meyers taking on the Los Angeles Rams. Not only is it an advantageous matchup, but of course, we're in a situation here where, again, with no Davante Adams, there should be a lot of opportunity going in the direction of Jakobi Meyers. Now, he did miss last week due to an ankle injury, and hopefully he's going to be healthy and ready to go because in the last 11 starts that he has made with Aiden O'Connell as his starting quarterback this season and last season, averaging 6.2 targets, 4.0 receptions, 48 receiving yards, 0.27 receiving touchdowns, 10.12 fantasy points per game. He would be a solid option within the overall week. 10 plus points would be in the realm of possibility with even more target upside anticipated. Moving on to our number 33, Jameson Williams. Look, Jameson Williams could very easily outproduce this number if he once again has a huge reception. And thus far this season, each of those games having himself a huge reception. Against most recently, a 37-yard grab for a touchdown, a 70-yard grab for a touchdown, a 52-yard grab, and then a 50-yard grab for a touchdown. There have been many of instances this season where Jameson Williams, over the top of opposing defenses, is making himself known and finding himself a lot of success and fantasy upside. Honestly, 33 is probably a low overall standing, especially considering we are anticipating a fiery shootout between these two teams. Either way, Jameson Williams, again, needs that big play. Otherwise, if he does not find that big play within the overall matchup, a lackluster performance could be in line, unfortunately. Moving on to our number 34, Josh Downs. One of the slot receiving options that, if in fact he still had Flacco, would be significantly higher, mainly because Flacco within this offense in the last 2 games has had 38 and 44 passing attempts, which has led to Josh Downs, 12 and 9 targets. That kind of opportunity share really wasn't common when Anthony Richardson was the quarterback, especially in terms of overall passing attempts and the targets in the direction of Josh Downs. Therefore, we're going to anticipate a downgrade in this overall circumstance. Taking on Miami's defense, again, they're going to run the ball consistently, but if Anthony Richardson is up for the task on hand, hopefully Josh Downs is going to be his new safety blanket and consistently getting targets on a weekly basis. Moving on to our number 35, George Pickens. In the overall conversation of a quarterback change, with Russell Wilson taking the first team snaps earlier today, there is an anticipation that Russell Wilson being the starting quarterback is hopefully going to allow George Pickens to be a better wide receiver option for fantasy, mainly because Russell Wilson, in comparison to Justin Fields, is a more polished passing option. So if this is going to elevate the overall upside of George Pickens, fantastic. Unfortunately, does take on one of the more difficult matchups, taking on Sauce Gardner and that secondary of the New York Jets. Not an easy matchup at all, but hopefully Russell Wilson within his first overall week, a guy who was able to elevate Courtland Sutton to scoring 10 touchdowns last year. Hopefully we can get similar production out of George Pickens henceforth. Moving on to our number 36, Romeo Doubs. Again, with Dontavion Wicks and Jayden Reed dealing with injuries, and of course Christian Watson still dealing with his overall ankle, there's a lot of opportunity for Romeo Doubs within the upcoming week, taking on the Houston Texans as the number 1 outside receiver of this offense in terms of overall snaps, routes ran, etc. Coming off of a week of 2 receiving touchdowns, you would anticipate that, of course, Romeo Doubs should be implicated for a solid week within this overall shootout between these two teams. Again, Houston versus the Green Bay Packers, assuming there is no weather that impacts it heavily. I mean, again, even with the weather last week, Jordan Love threw for 4 passing touchdowns and Romeo Doubs catching 2 of them. We're still implicated for a pretty solid week within the overall performance. Moving on to our number 37, we have Ladd McConkey. Look, the fact of the matter is he is the number 1 receiving option of this offense, and the Cardinals are the 9th best matchup at the position. Most recently, we have seen slot receiving options, Jayden Reed, 6 catches, 28 and a touchdown on 50% of the snaps, while Amon-Ra St. Brown a couple weeks prior, 7 for 75 and a touchdown. Ladd McConkey should be implicated for a solid week as a slot receiving option, taking on the Arizona Cardinals. Moving on to our number 38, we have Tyler Lockett. Look, the fact of the matter is, in the last 3 games, 9, 6, and 8 targets. So if you're going to average somewhere around 7 to 8 targets per game, beautiful, we love it. We're going to continue to start you, especially when he's putting up 8.6, 9.5, and 14.5 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He has his baseline of production being, 8 to 9 points, potentially 10 points. And if he ends up scoring a touchdown, he's even that much more valuable, considering they have been on a 3-game slide in negative game scripts every single time out. We're anticipating that Tyler Lockett is going to be implicated for a pretty high overall target share. Now, considering he's competing with Metcalf and JSN, it's going to be difficult, but still very valuable within fantasy. Moving on to our number 39, Michael Pittman Jr. Still dealing with a back injury. Didn't even practice today. So if in fact that back injury is going to continue to slow him down, if it wasn't for that just slowing him down, the fact that Flacco is now turning to, Anthony Richardson as the starting quarterback, we're anticipating less passing attempts, less accurate passing attempts, and less touchdowns. That is what has carried Michael Pittman Jr. in the last 2 weeks. His overall yardage count haven't been great. It is just the fact that he has scored touchdowns, which unfortunately going into this week may not be a possibility, specifically because, again, Miami's secondary has played very well this season. Moving on to our number 40. In the absence of Amari Cooper, you would anticipate that Jerry Jeudy's the next man up to be the number one receiving role. But that means he now has to take on number one cornerbacks. Taking on Cincinnati, again, it's not a difficult matchup, and they should be throwing for a majority of this overall game. Nonetheless, Jerry Jeudy, the next man up to potentially kind of fill in for the Amari Cooper role, which is about, 8 to 10 targets maybe on a given weekly basis. Moving on to our number 41, Michael Wilson. In the absence of Marvin Harrison Jr., considering he is on the concussion protocol, we're talking about Michael Wilson mainly because they take on the Chargers, and Michael Wilson has played and scored 9+ fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 games. You would anticipate him to get in within that range of overall upside, considering the absence of their number one receiver. Moving on to our number 42, Xavier Legette. Taking on the Washington Commanders, it's as good of a matchup as you could possibly ask for, the 5th best at the position. In a negative game script in the second half, a lot of target opportunities should be going in the direction of Xavier Legette. We know that Coker is potentially getting himself more and more utilization as the number 3 receiving option. Hopefully that does not dig into the overall upside of Legette as we progress within this upcoming game. The final wide receiver I wanted to mention is Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper is probably going to move up. Do not forget the rankings are always subject to change. By the time I get to Sunday morning's overall live stream, rankings change drastically based on overall information, injuries, etc. We heard earlier today from the head coach of the Bills that he was very much so non-committal on the idea of Cooper playing this week. He still needs to learn the offense in comparison to Davante Adams, who knows how to run an Aaron Rodgers offense. So if in fact Amari Cooper does not play, so be it. If he does play, we'll have him ranked somewhere within the top 40. Exactly where will be determined. Do not forget that Amari Cooper last season, in the final 5 games of the year with Joe Flacco, averaging 9.4 targets per game and 17.38 fantasy points per game. When given ample opportunity with accurate overall passes, expect high upside for Amari Cooper. All right, that's going to cover it for my top 43 wide receiver rankings for Week 7 of the 2024 fantasy football season. I want to thank you all for watching. Again, I'll be live later tonight, starting at 7 to 7:15 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. One of those start times, somewhere between that range. Either way, it's going to be an hour to hour and a half long live stream. So be sure to swing on by if you have any questions. Thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with our tight end and quarterback rankings. Until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.